Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our session, Network Pathways to Economic Mobility, Tackling Opportunity Gaps by Investing in Networks, Not Just Skills. I'm delighted to be joined by these esteemed panelists who are going to share their expertise and wisdom really at the cutting edge of an issue that I think at conferences like ASU GSB rarely get addressed head on, even though people often attend these conferences to build and broker new networks and expand their own opportunities. So excited to dive into this topic. I first want to thank the sponsor for our session, ASA. ASA is a national nonprofit with a mission to help students know themselves, know their options, and make informed career and post-secondary education decisions. And ASA has been a supporter of ours at the Clayton Christensen Institute, where I work, supporting our latest tool and playbook focused on building and strengthening students' networks. And when we talk about networks as we are today, I want to highlight that we think investing in networks is really an equity issue. And to be equitable, you have to be systematic and data-driven and invest in learners and workers' existing networks, their support networks, and their professional networks, and all the way those three can overlap, which I think the four organizations we're talking to today are incredibly thoughtful about. And we see all of this in our own research at the Christensen Institute as really a linchpin to securing employment and upwardly mobile jobs. So the four organizations we have here today, Big Picture Learning, BASTA, Braven, and Mentor Spaces, are all really leaders in taking a systematic approach to building and strengthening students' networks. And we're going to be talking about various steps your organizations, whether you're an investor or a technology company or a direct service provider, can start to take to learn lessons from these early innovators in expanding workers and learners networks. I'm going to have everyone introduce themselves, and I would love for you to share not just who you are and where you work, but in line with our theme today, who helped you get where you are today in your current leadership role in the education to employment space. And I'll start with Andrew Frischman from Big Picture Learning.
Thanks so much, Julia. A real pleasure. Excited to get to join. I'm Andrew Frischman, the co-executive director of Big Picture Learning, and we're a national, based in the United States, impact organization. Also convene an international network of schools and initiatives, big picture initiatives around the world. And our mission is to activate the potential of students, systems, and education through interest-driven real-world learning. Now, as I said, I'm the co-executive director, but I really still think of myself as a teacher and educator. It was almost 20 years ago, to your question of who helped. I met Elliot Washer and Dennis Littke, who are the co-founders of Big Picture. They hired myself and Carlos Moreno, who is the larger half of our co-executive directorship. We were advisors at the Met High School, which was at the time the only big picture school in the world. It was in Providence, Rhode Island. And it's really been the connections and the deep relationships with Carlos and Elliot and Dennis, and then the extended Big Picture Learning team and family and kind of our extended network that helps me not only get into my current leadership role, really, feels like it continue every day. Doesn't feel like I've arrived at some sort of destination. I think we're on a journey together. So a pleasure to be on this part of the journey.
Awesome, thanks, Andrew. Sheila, can you go next?
Sure. Sheila Sarum, founder of BASTA. We are a New York-based nonprofit. We connect first-generation college students to great first jobs. We started as a direct service program model and then realized we'd figured out some stuff. And so 2 years ago, launched Powered by BASTA, where we support other organizations infuse really strong career readiness programming, content, and supports to their students and staff. Yeah, that's where we are right now. In terms of the question around who helped me, I think I'm first generation American, and so have spent a lot of time, finding my own mentors and carving out my own path. And I will say I made one critical call when I realized I was ready to take the plunge into entrepreneurship, to a mentor that I had sought out and cultivated. And I will never forget, I said, I think I'm ready to do this. And she said, don't look back. You're doing it like we're doing this together. And those words were so critical in that moment. Had I called someone else who said, are you sure? I might have made a really different decision. And so that conversation sticks out so much for me because it gave me the courage to take the plunge.
Such a good example, Sheila, of how networks aren't just about kind of instrumental help to get a job or promotion, but actually giving you faith in yourself, kind of, and that sort of emotional support that can reinforce your identity as an entrepreneur. Ami, can you go next?
Sure. My name is Ami Eubanks Davis. I'm the founder and CEO of Braven. We work in partnership with colleges and employers to help students who are first in their families go to college on the Pell Grant, often, who are underrepresented minorities, make the strong transition into the workforce. And we do that by running a course alongside and within universities and colleges, where students get a really rigorous career acceleration experience. And the secret in the Braven sauce, and I know we'll talk about this a little bit later, is actually we get professionals from the workforce to coach teams of 5 to 8 students. And that is intentional because it helps to develop their professional networks, which often they do not have any access to at the point when they enter Braven. And there were, I would say, 80,000 people over 8 years that inspired me to make the plunge, as Sheila put it, into the world of college to career work. And that's because I was actually running the human capital effort for Teach for America, where Wendy Kopp, who's a longtime mentor of mine, had asked me to take over our human capital work. We had 50,000 young people applying to the teaching corps. A lot of people knew that. We also had 30,000 folks applying to our staff, and it happened to be that one of my former students and then a bunch of other young people like her started to apply in large numbers, and we could see through the data that they were actually struggling to come over our admissions bar. Of course, there was a lot that we needed to do to reduce the bias in the model, but what I knew as a former educator was that there was something not right, that this group of young people were earning the bachelor's degree and coming out and basically only earning 66 cents on the dollar to their higher income peers. So that's how I ended up getting inspired to figure this little part of a problem out.
Little/enormous part based on the topics explored at this conference, I think. Thanks, Ami. And finally, Chris, share a little bit about yourself and Mentor Spaces.
Well, thanks again, Julia, for having me, and thanks for all the panelists. I've been inspired by your work, secret fan on the sideline. My name is Chris Motley, founder and CEO of Mentor Spaces, where we help Fortune 1000 companies to better attract, hire, and retain underrepresented talent by facilitating conversations between employees and entry-level job candidates. In terms of who helped me, we can be here all day. It takes a village, it's real. But I think I would say, especially in my work that I do today, we had a relationship with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which funded really important research that sort of got me out of my own way to look at this problem of career pathways a lot differently than I had before. And it serves as a foundation for what we're doing at Mentor Spaces. So really happy to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Chris, I like that example as sort of the other side of the coin of Sheila talking about emotional support, someone investing in your confidence identity. There's also financial resources that travel through networks that can be a game changer. So thanks for sharing that reflection. So as we dive in, we're going to hear about each of these 4 models and the sort of unique components of building and strengthening students' networks that you guys have chosen to tackle. I think just as a header for all of this, the common theme across all 4 of your models is that skills and credentials are not enough. They are necessary but insufficient to actually level the playing field of access to opportunity. And a lot of times when you think about networking, right, you hear about programs that urge students to build a LinkedIn profile or attend a job fair here or there. What you guys are doing is much deeper work. Chris, I loved your phrase of actually facilitating conversations between people, right? Authentic relationship building, not just sort of scaling access to connections and fingers crossed that one of those converts into an opportunity. So let's dive into what that actually looks like in practice. And I want to start with you, Andrew. When it comes to investing in students' networks, one of the key steps that we've observed in our research often gets overlooked is actually taking stock of who students already know, right? Despite the sort of philosophy that I think a lot of organizations are trying to embrace, that students arrive as whole people with sort of stories and narratives and experiences that exist already, a lot of programs, almost in service of expediency and efficiency, focus immediately on what are the new networks we can put in place for students? How can we connect them to new people? But big picture schools are actually really mindful of this step of taking stock of students' networks and particularly thinking about latent opportunities in those networks. Can you talk through what that looks like in practice, particularly when it comes to scaling access to internship opportunities for your students?
Yeah, thanks, Julia. I'm so glad that you're asking us, because it's certainly something that we feel passionately about. I mean, I think particularly over the course of the last decade, there's been a lot of discussion about in the education sort of world in general about the need to take an assets-based approach to young people. Usually this is raised in discussions about kind of content and skills, and even Paulo Freire talked about the banking model of education, right? That students can be mistakenly perceived as this empty account that educators have to make deposits into, trying to fill them up. And I feel, and we at Big Picture feel, it's a highly problematic metaphor. And just as with content, I feel that in the frame of social capital, we need to be really, really careful not to diminish students and families and communities by sort of inappropriately and inaccurately focusing on what's missing. That can just lead us down a road, again, as you said, of sort of focusing on sort of, it inadvertently diminishes, I think, where young people are coming in, and the richness that is present in students and families and communities. So our approach, as you alluded to, we really engage with families and communities. The word "with" is very important to us. And I think, what that means is, even in my role as an advisor, I mentioned at the Met in Providence and then in Sacramento and across our entire network, most often the first meetings that occur is a home visit, right? So prior to a young person even walking into a school building, we have a student's advisor. We sort of rename the term teacher advisor as an advisor. And so they'll meet with a student and their parents or guardians at their home or at someplace local in the community they feel comfortable with, to really start asking questions about them and their experiences and their interests, and find out, what are the things that you love and that you want to get better at? What are the things you haven't been so good at what are the things you'd love to explore? And really finding out about who are your parents, your guardians, your extended family members, what kinds of fields have they worked in? And because, that gesture of sort of saying, I'm coming to you to understand who you are and where you're coming from, can signal to a family that there are ways that they can give back and that they can be connected to. And so I think, that's one example of a way to right from the outset, establish that tone that, like, we're in this learning adventure together. And then I think the next piece that we do as students are coming into the school, one of the most common activities that we do right at the beginning is to get students in sort of mixed age groups. So you got these brand new, bright-eyed, green rookie ninth graders, with the veteran, sort of salty 12th graders who have like, hey, we've done this kind of thing before. And one of the things we're doing right in that first week of school to set that tone is, you're not just going to stay in the classroom. You're not going to stay in the school building. We're going to send you out in small groups to go do some community mapping. Now, we might call it like a scavenger hunt, but we're going to send them out to go find a bunch of local community businesses and organizations. Some of them could be places that older students have interned with before. And we're going to demonstrate to those ninth graders, it's not quite so scary. You can walk into these local places and you can introduce yourself and you can start practicing and explaining who you are and why you walked in the door and what the school is all about. And I think that that shifts the frame. Instead of saying like, oh, what don't we have in our area? What do we have in the neighborhood? Who can we walk in? And I think, that takes me again to some of like the way Putnam has talked about capital. It's out there. It's not necessarily a measure of just, is it present or not? It's what are the connections across these different, lines of difference. So just excited to connect with families and get young people connected with the things that are in their community.
Awesome. And Andrew, we'll circle back in a little bit when we're talking about technology, of how I think you guys have also taken sort of a huge stride in storing those connections in kind of a collective Rolodex that other students can tap into. Because I think one of the things you're speaking to is this idea of a student's individual network is powerful, but if you're running a program or an institution, how do you share resources across that network? For Sheila and Ami, I want to sort of talk about, okay, as long as you sort of recognize these existing assets, we also know that students and young people need support networks, and what the literature would call webs of support. And as Chris mentioned, it takes a village, right? That this isn't just sort of one and done support mechanisms through formal mechanisms like a college advisor. You actually need to be embedded in a web of support to thrive. And that's actually universally true. That's not just for low income or disadvantaged students. It's actually for all students. I'm curious though, both BASTA and Braven have really taken a deliberate approach to seeding support networks. And why is that support function so important? And what does it actually look like for students? So Sheila, you maybe want to go first. If I'm a student participating in BASTA, who am I turning to for support, and how is that actually kind of structural in your model?
Yeah, so we shorthand social capital within the BASTA program as a combination of knowledge and networks. And so we're very, very intentional about not presenting our program as filling a skills gap. It's a knowledge gap. Maybe someone has never shared with you, you need to send a thank you note, right? So we're really intentional about knowledge and networks as both being really critical to social capital. And so when we start working with students, we really try to emphasize the importance of, there's some knowledge that you need, and there's also networks you need. But networking, as I think is typically thought of as like you're sitting in a room and clinking glasses and making small talk. But what we try to help young people see is there's a career readiness journey path that they're on. It starts with understanding themselves, understanding the world of work. It starts with understanding the job market, how they align, and then interviewing for jobs. And so what we're really intentional about across our program model is helping young people think about who can help me at this moment, how can they help me, and what do I need from them? But in order to even get to that, we have to work on mindsets first. And so what we find is a lot of the young people we meet, they're close to the end of college. They may have never had access to any kind of support program. And so in their minds, everyone else has gotten to where they are on their own. And so we spend a lot of time on sharing examples, surfacing for them what it looks like to get help, who's gotten help, Mark Zuckerberg's, dad seeded Facebook, really just bringing it up as often as we can and making sure we're building mindsets around support networks. And then we can build the sort of knowledge gap or the muscle memory for how do I reach out to the person I need when I need them and how can they help me? And then we really think about the network as sort of 3 key nodes. So we look at peers and near peers as a place where young people can get just-in-time information, like, hey, did you interview at that company? What do they ask you? Which is a perfectly acceptable, I think, question for young people to be asking each other to, hey, I'm feeling a lot of doubt going into this interview. Like everyone that I, met in my previous interview looks to be, doesn't look like me or doesn't come from my background. How did you manage that? So socio-emotional and just-in-time advice is how we think about peers and near peers. But we do not ignore the fact that the fastest path to getting a great first job is being in relationship, having a direct point of contact to somebody with power, money, and privilege. And so wherever possible, and when the time is right, so the who, how, and what do I need from them, we will make sure that young people are being strategically connected to our volunteers and our employer partners to support them in landing that first job, acknowledging that that is just as critical as how well you perform in your interview. So those are sort of the ways that we think about and build sort of social capital mindsets and the mechanics for accessing other folks into our program model. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Awesome. Yeah, super helpful. I mean, and I think you're talking about a foundational, both programmatic philosophy, but also structure when you talk about normalizing the concept of support before you try and provide it or put it on offer. And also creating one thing we've observed as we've documented BASTA's approach, really a culture of information sharing among your participants, which really is exchanging those resources and knowledge, right? But it's a culture, it's not going to happen just automatically if you haven't sort of seeded that. Ami, thoughts here? I know that Braven in its early days discovered really the power of the peer connections within your model. And also, as you mentioned, you offer sort of mentorship as well as part of your model. So how do you think about offering support?
Yeah, so, again, I'm a former teacher and a talent nerd, so it shouldn't be shocking that Braven is a course. I deeply believe in teaching and learning and that there are certain things, including how to network and honestly how to form a community of support over time that can be taught and then utilized and honestly have enduring understanding for a lifetime. And so in the course, the cohort is 5 to 8 on purpose. Very much so research-based in terms of sort of what size of a group actually can stick together over time, because Braven students are typically in their sophomore year of college when they take the course, or they're transfer juniors from the community colleges that there are nearby, where they're going to their four-year granting institution. And basically, what we've realized is actually the power of the cohort on the campus is in and of itself powerful, because many of the schools that we work with are very large. They're large state schools, for example, like San Jose State, 26,000 undergrads. Many of the students are commuter students that are coming on and off campus. So that it's actually far harder for them to form relationships with their peer group, but also with professors and other people on campus, because they're often going to school full time and they're going to work full time. And I think that's one thing that people often, I know I didn't when I got into this, take into account was how much time is actually being spent also going to work. And so that deliberate connection to peers we've realized is huge. And then also is this correct connection into the professional workforce, because what I would say is that for this group of young people, it is an additive form of relationship building and networking, because what happens is the coach, and we call them a coach on purpose, not a mentor, but a coach because they have to coach their team through the course and through the rigors of the course, which includes skills and networks and mindsets and all of that piece. And what we've realized is actually it is those coaches that end up opening up their networks in exponential ways to their students. And their networks are far greater, honestly, in the professional sense than our students are. But we've just realized that the combination of the two is what really creates the power in what we're doing.
Awesome. I think Sheila and Ami, you both, and Big Picture Learning actually does this as well, sort of in their advisory and internship model, have just so beautifully woven together what we all know from lived experience, that like you need people to help you get by and get ahead. And if it's just one or the other, it's sort of necessary but insufficient. And really figuring out program models that scale both. So Chris is here to talk about technology. No, I'm kidding. But I want to point out, right, Chris, you've been listening to sort of these on the ground direct services models that these three organizations are pursuing. And you have taken a slightly different tack of building a technology company, Mentor Spaces, but that is really tackling some of these same challenges of where do learners and workers find both support networks and professional sponsorship to get ahead in their careers. So would love to hear you sort of talk about, first of all, what Mentor Spaces is, but also how you see technology playing a role in really diversifying the pipeline, because we actually know technology could just be an accelerant of existing broken pipelines, and it has been historically, I'd argue. How is Mentor Spaces different and sort of tackling this from a new angle?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate the comments that my colleagues sort of mentioned, because it's a lot of your work that I looked at when creating Mentor Spaces. And the first thing I would say, and it's a word that I think, Sheila, you mentioned, is just sort of intentionality. So technology in and of itself isn't going to solve anything. It's what is it built for? So for us, we've taken this approach of mentorship, which I think everyone has mentioned, but you have to sort of unpack, well, what exactly is mentorship when you're trying to build technology to facilitate it? And for us, we say, well, mentorship is basically a conversation with someone in the know. And so we are very intentional about building technology to facilitate those conversations with people in the know. Sheila, you mentioned something about, almost unpacking the relationships that you're helping to facilitate in your program. And we look at it almost in a very similar way, which is, what are my goals? Who can help me right now? Where are they? And when and how can I connect with them? And very simply, that creates a very tight model that you can use technology to scale. But I think another key point as well that Ami mentioned is this whole idea of learning how to have these relationships, learning how to have these conversations. And the role of the coach in our model is technology, which is part service and part tech, to help teach people how to be a good mentor or teach people how to be a mentee. There's no mentor school out there. And so you have to have the combination of both the technology and sort of the mindset for, how to maximize these relationships or to have sort of these quality conversations. What makes us different is, well, number one, building technology that helps to enhance and enable the work that's already being done. So it's built for scale. The second is we take a community-driven approach. So you have organizations that have great programs, but they're not necessarily funded to invest in technology. And so it limits their impact. And so by focusing our sort of positioning in the market to help close this technology gap, well, you can scale the efforts that many nonprofit organizations, colleges and universities and other programs already have in play, but again, without the ability to scale. So that's a little bit of how we think about it. The last thing I'll mention is something that Andrew said, which is this whole idea of width. And networks are very different from community. And I would argue that communities are much stronger. And I read a book, and I can't remember the name of it right now, but I will. But basically, when you think about building communities, it's about what you do with individuals or people versus what you do for them. And so that's a really important concept in our work as well, because again, it takes a village. We have to create feedback loops and help people understand that we're in this together, not that, we are doing things for you and we'll continue to do that for the rest of time. It's really this community-driven approach, all the way down to the literal sense of what do you want this community to be? How are you contributing to it so that we can continually improve over time?
Yeah, imagine if our social media tools of today had been built with that philosophy in mind, right? And I think just to editorialize a second of what we're seeing field wide, one of the measures of network strength that's starting to emerge is actually measuring reciprocity within a relationship, right? Which is actually very different than measuring engagement or one-way information or knowledge transfer. So I think that's a really powerful way to anchor, Chris, exactly what you're talking about, along with Andrew, of the sort of width. So because it's ASU GSB, I want to stick with the technology theme for a second and hear about what the other three organizations are doing and thinking about when it comes to technology. Sheila, I want you to go first here. Basta, as you mentioned, has been sort of cooking up a proprietary technology around your career diagnostic. Give a little bit of background of where that came about and how you're thinking about scale, to Chris's point.
Yeah, so when we launched Basta, we thought, okay, there's amazing young people graduating from college that are more than ready for the world of work because of their lived experience. And there's employers who say they want to hire them. We know that, like, for some reason, these two communities don't connect regularly, and we want to understand why. And so we really started with what is a young person's career experience as they're going through college. And as we learned alongside young people, we actually found that the path of moving from who am I, what do I care about, what does the world of work look like? How do my skills and interests align to that? What is the job market and how do I interview for those jobs? Like, that's a pretty linear process. And I think we often hop skip past those first two steps. Who am I? What do I care about? And how does that connect to the world of work? And we start with the transactional networking, resumes, asset-based coaching. And so, as we discovered, there's actually a pretty logical way to go through the experience of discovery, whether you're a high school student picking college, a college student picking a first job, a career changer who had an existential moment post-COVID. We're all going through this sort of similar experience. And so we realized we can actually, map this, capture the data, and then when we meet young people, really have a more precise intervention for them, depending on where they are on that career readiness journey. And so I think what's specifically exciting to me about the career readiness diagnostic is it's a 20-minute assessment. Any young person can take it from their phone. And it doesn't say, like, Julia, you're smart, you like numbers, but you also like people, you should be a data analyst. It says, hey, Julia, it sounds like you know enough about yourself, but maybe not enough about industries yet. So why don't you spend some time focusing on industries? Or Julia, you seem to know like what you want, and you also seem to know how it maps to industries. Start applying, get the confidence to start applying. So it really helps young people understand where they are on that journey roadmap and what the right next step is to help them get to the next milestone or the next phase of it. Just tying this back to our conversation about networking, it also helps us to contextualize networking or social capital or, connecting with others. So if I'm at the beginning of my journey, the diagnostic report that I get might say, schedule calls with 5 people and ask them these types of questions to really understand what the world of work is about. If I'm like way far along my journey and I'm interviewing for jobs, the diagnostic might say, like, you need to be scheduling more preparation calls with people from that industry. So it helps us to really contextualize all this language that just sounds like buzzwords to young people because of the way we use the language out of context. We're super excited. We're in year one of launching a technology. I will reach out to Chris because it is new. It is new for us, but it is super exciting. I think it allows us to get really precise, meet students where they are, and not waste their time, which at the end of the day is like probably my deepest driver, is how do we use young people's time well that they are so kindly sharing with us.
Awesome. So powerful, Sheila. And I think just this point on context, I mean, if I can just like stand on a soapbox for a second about so many tools in this sort of ASU GSV orbit are like taking labor market data and just like putting it in front of people in new formats and not offering context or that sort of personalized reflection and guidance that I think you're trying to start with, despite the fact that we know labor market data is incredibly important on the back end to sort of right size expectations, et cetera. Awesome. So Andrew, can you share a little bit about how Big Picture Learning thinks about technology as a sort of accelerant and, as I mentioned, kind of a Rolodex tool for sourcing and storing opportunities?
Yeah, first, I'm just excited to learn more about mentor spaces in FOSTA. There's a bunch of resonance there. So thank you for setting that up. And I think
it's not a coincidence that I brought on this. Well, this is actually its own networking opportunity.
Well, to use a term that you use, like you looked into your Rolodex, right? And I think it's interesting that a Rolodex itself is a technology that enables people, right? So in some ways it's archaic, but it's like it's also an example of a technology that helps people keep track of their whole set of contexts, right? And contexts. So I'll mention, Big Picture Learning, one of our main technology initiatives is something called Emblaze. And Emblaze really comes out of my own experience as we call it an LTI coordinator, learning through interests and internships. There are lots of words out there for it. It can be called a work-based learning coordinator, a co-op or internship coordinator, a real-world learning or extended learning opportunities. I think, the common experience is that, out in a conventional high school, or a program that's going to start having lots of students go outside of the classroom and begin engaging in situated learning at businesses and community organizations, they can get paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. It can just freak them out, right? So particularly administrators say, oh my gosh, I'd love to have my kids do that, but I don't know, like, what's the list of sites that they're going to go to? How will I match those kids to their interests? How will I know that they showed up? Is there some adult there that's supervising them? What are they learning? And so the information and that coordination and communication is something that we just saw there was a real, issue with. I want to make really clear, like, you can do this really without technology. And, for a small number of kids, you can do it for a small number of kids, and you can do it in a super labor intensive way. And that, quite honestly, is what Big Picture Learning schools did for the first 20 years, and over 50 locations across the US and a bunch of places internationally. But they really were existing and doing this through like just kind of a brute force method. And as a result, we went out and looked and tried to find, like, there's got to be somebody who's built a platform that can help to do this thing. And we just couldn't find anybody who had done it. So we built Emblaze really to enable this to be done more efficiently, more consistently, more effectively at scale. So really, you can look at Emblaze as something that just lowers the administrative burden. Emblaze is a software application. It's now live in 150 locations. We've got 30,000 users. The goal that we've been delivering on and really rapidly growing and expanding is to make it possible for schools and programs to support the development of these relationships at scale. So it's not so much that the technology drives and says, oh, we've got this technology, now we can do this thing. It's really the things that I've been hearing across this conversation about getting young people connected around their interests to mentors. How can we do that and support it? What's the technology that undergirds that and makes it just easier and more efficient, so that the adults who are vitally important in this can spend their time engaged with the student and the mentors and the sites, and not like tracking a 2,000 line Excel spreadsheet like that. We're past those days.
Elbow grease and spreadsheets, I like to call it, the early days of any early technology tool. Yeah,
oh, my elbow's greasy. I didn't realize, but they must have been.
Well, I couldn't see them. Yeah. Well, just to connect back to Andrew's first sort of talking point around being asset based, Emblaze is also a tool, at least in some of the use cases, where students and advisors can upload potential internship opportunities that they know of in their existing networks. And again, those become a shared resource across the school community. So check out those two technologies. Ami, I want to shift to you and how Braven thinks about technology, particularly in I don't know if we can call this a post-COVID era yet. We're in this like weird limbo, at least where I live, of like wearing masks, but like not following any other protocols. But I'm curious to hear, Braven has always been blended, right? The course that you guys deliver is delivered partly online and partly face-to-face. Is that staying the same? Is it evolving? Are campuses asking for fully virtual? How are you thinking about this moving ahead?
Yeah, so it's interesting because often when our fellows talk about Braven, they often never talk about the technology part, and 80% of the Braven experience is actually online. And we have not only the online platform from a learning standpoint, but also we have a bunch of tools that students use throughout their 3-year experience. So again, they take the course as sophomores, transfer juniors. We continue to support them for another 2.5 years with our employer partners to help them on going out on treks and with professional mentorship, et cetera, but also with these tools to help them match to jobs. That said, again, I'm a former teacher and a talent nerd. And, in the moment that we're in right now, like, people can't wait to get back around people, honestly. I mean, truly, our campuses pretty much are all saying we are going back in person in a pretty significant way. And even when you think about this, I have 3 children of my own, like, which set of kids this year learned less, at least in K-12, who didn't step foot into school buildings or not for very long. And so I've always thought about how important technology is from a delivery standpoint, from the tools that can enhance the learning, but never as a substitute for people. And it's why I said what I said in the beginning, this little problem. I believe what we're working on, at least in the world of Braven, is a ridiculously solvable problem that I've ever seen in education. Like, when it really is about having people get to know each other better, making sure that they understand where they might go next, et cetera, you can actually make it possible for a student at this point in time to absolutely come out and earn a full dollar instead of 66 cents on the dollar. And when I think about the racial wealth gap, which is really what we're going after in the world of Braven, in my own experience growing up in low-income Black communities and having a family that ended up becoming super economically mobile, it really was the people who helped to catapult that journey. So the technology is critical for us. From a delivery standpoint, we work on 4 different campuses. We're on our way to a 5th campus. It's super important from a delivery standpoint. And during the pandemic, everything was online, and we actually performed really strong. So we will continue to have an online version of Braven for any university or any students that want that. But my sneaky suspicion is that by and large, people are going to want the hybrid version again.
Awesome. And I think one of the things, Ami, Braven, from talking to your organization, talking to Basta as well over the last 1.5 years or so, going into this pandemic with a relationship model, right? With a deliberate approach to broken relationships, that actually translates online very differently than if you're a model that doesn't have an explicit, deliberate, measurable approach to building relationships. And so for anyone listening who's building an online tool and assuming that just because people are online, they're forming connections, I think that's a really dangerous assumption. So thanks for that sort of warning, Ami. Sheila, did you raise your little hand or no? I thought I saw a hand go up.
I'm trying to heart what Ami was saying, but I realized I don't have that on this. So
Okay, so you've got a heart hand wave, Ami, on that. Chris, I want to come back to you, and others would love for you to weigh in on this last question, but this is one place where I do see technology as, to be really wonky in researcher terms for a second, disrupting the decay rate of our relationships. So our relationships naturally decay if we don't maintain them. And we have now these tools that can allow us to maintain them more efficiently and maintain more of them. And so Chris, as you think about building relationships or networks, or to use your word, communities that last, that aren't just like one-time programs, one-time interventions, but actually outlast the particular moment that they're formed and continue to offer value to workers and learners. How do you think about that, either as a design challenge in technology or in Mentor Spaces itself, how you guys have maybe constructed conversations that kind of plant the seeds of those lasting connections?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I can answer it in so many different ways. But the first way I would answer it is going back to this point of mindset. So if an individual thinks of themselves as a business and understand, what their unique resources are, what their skills are, how they deliver value to a particular customer through time, then that mindset and that framework almost serves as a foundation or a playbook, if you will, that allows students to sort of or not even students, people to engage and maintain relationships. So that's one point, which is mindset. The second point is just the recognition that a single conversation could change someone's life, right? And so sometimes we can over-index on having these long relationships that are drawn out, but really it's just one conversation, and you let it go where it needs to go. For me personally, I met someone when I was 19 years old who helped me understand what a commodities trader was. And he worked at this funny name company called Goldman Sachs, or at least it was a funny name to me at the time. But that single conversation of understanding what that job was, what that company represented, and how I can perform in that particular job changed everything for me. And I didn't have to have 50 conversations with this individual. I did, but it wasn't necessary. And so I think that more important than anything else is the recognition from the individual's perspective of, as Sheila said, what am I trying to accomplish, and who are the people that I can tap into to help me get there? And then to build on something that Ami said earlier is this notion of horizontal networks and communities as well. It's not just this hierarchical sort of relationship. If I had known at the time other Black and brown folks who were interested in Wall Street, more specifically commodities trading, maybe my career would have been even better than it already was, because that's super important of these kind of cohorts of individuals working together. So those are the things I think about when you talk about maintaining sort of relationships and community. And with mentor spaces, our vision in part is really creating this safe space where people can engage in the practice of mentorship. And I purposely frame it like that because everyone has something to give and everyone has something to learn. And so this whole idea of reciprocity that you mentioned is that, well, if the subject matter changes, let's say nonprofit management, I would be horrible at that, but I have a few ideas of who could help me, right? Or when it changes to technology, or when it changes to digital marketing, whatever it may be, the strengths of individuals can come out and come to the forefront, which can help sort of build that reciprocity, which basically comes back to the quality of relationships and community as a whole.
Awesome. Yeah, I think, Chris, one of the things you're pointing to, I know you may not think of mentor spaces as a curriculum play, but this idea of engaging in the practice of something, that's really experiential learning, right? And to Ami's point about this being a learning agenda alongside a connecting agenda, you're arming learners and workers with both the mindsets and the skills to leverage networks down the line.
You're exactly right. I do not think about it as a
I know, sorry.
but it's I think it's a really important point. I think as we are designing things, maybe internally we do, but it never comes off like that. And I think that's a big difference about what is the user experience to where it almost becomes invisible. Ami talked about how technology is about, the delivery, right? But it almost is invisible because of the programming that they sort of built around it. And that's ultimately, I think, what the goal is that it's so integrated that you don't even know you're leveraging technology. It's all about the outcomes you're trying to achieve.
Awesome. So other panelists, any last thoughts on this topic of building networks that last, either the mindsets to continue to foster and nurture your own networks as an individual, or continuing to foster the communities that you've built in your respective programs?
Yeah, I'll chime in. I think, that question of like lasting, if it doesn't last, I'm not sure that it's worth working on, honestly. And I'll say one of the things, 25 years ago, it was basically impossible to track longitudinal outcomes of high school students. And I think, the advent, problematic though it is, the advent of so much social media means that we've been able to stay in touch with alumni much, much more effectively. We were able to just publish, in partnership with some researchers at Boston College, Dr. Karen Arnold and her team, a longitudinal study looking at what are the effects of a big picture approach 5, 10, 15 years after you get out of high school? What are the things that really mattered? And what we heard from students is that the advisory was vitally important, right? So they had this sort of family feel for over 4 years, and it created, on the one hand, this network of peer support, but there's also a kind of social accountability, right? And that is that when you have educators telling a group of you, hey, like, you are the future leaders of this community, you're the future leaders of this country, you can shape what this future is. When students know they're going to be in touch with each other over many years, part of it is like, well, when I come back together, like, what am I doing? Like, how's it going? And what am I seeing my peers do? And I really want to focus on that. Like, I think even in this conversation, we've gone back and forth between the I and the we, and I think it's a both and, but the we is so vitally important, right? I'm hearing, you know, Chris and Sheila mention that, like, part of what it is that we're doing is an intentional disruption of individual competition. We're trying to say, like, when you create that sense of we, when students know that they'll be together, and I've been with my alumni over the course of, like, you know, weddings and housewarmings and births and funerals of their parents, right, as they're entering into the sandwich generation. And so I think that's so vitally important. Like, that connection is so powerful. And then also the mentors. You know, Sheila highlighted the importance of, like, interest and, like, tapping into what when young people get to meet mentors, because they're just bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, fired-up teenagers. Like, I've seen that turn out in very specific cases for alumni, that they had internships in hospitals when they were 16 years old. And now, 16 years later, they are lead administrators in that same hospital. Like, that is not coincidence. That's because they met people who helped bring them in. And that's what we're seeing, you know, through that longitudinal study. And I'll just say in closing, like, that, a real current initiative that my colleague Carla Cruz-Godo is building out as through her fellowship with WISE, is to build our alumni association to really look at cross linkages, not only within individual schools, but across our network. And so I think that, like, those kinds of alumni associations can be vitally important. That's sort of the edge that we're really trying to build out.
And I'll just point out from a research standpoint, Andrew, you mentioned the Karen Arnold study, which we can include as a link, but the source of data for that study was your existing networks, which is it's a radically different way to think about longitudinal data. It's not in some, like, back-end system coded with zeros and ones.
Totally. And tough to compare. Like, we would love, like, that's why I'm so excited to be a part of this ecosystem. Is like, we need 50, 100, 1,000 organizations that are tracking that kind of longitudinal data, so we can compare and contrast and learn, like, how do we do this better?
Working. Yeah, exactly. Sheila, Ami, last thoughts on sort of building networks that last? Sheila, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I see people logic they use to approach this kind of work is build it and they will come, which is like not the case. Young people are incredibly savvy about monitoring their social medias, monitoring their channels, monitoring their email. They respond when they find something valuable. And that's what we've seen time and again. A young person will, like, be off the grid and ignoring us for 6 months, and then they'll respond to something. And we're like, oh, you have been, like, kind of checking what we're sending. And you responded when you felt like you saw the value for yourself, which is great and savvy and super smart. And I think acknowledging that they are operating with that level of savvy and understanding that our role is to build value, I just think is so critically important. And I think Andrew, you know, started with that, and I just want to echo it because, you know, so many models are, if we build this thing, we're going to solve this problem. And I would encourage any, like, you know, budding entrepreneurs or people exploring technologies for young people to really explore, like, what is going to drive someone to pay attention to my thing with so much coming at them, because they're watching and they're monitoring and they're picking the things that they think will bring their lives value.
Also, such a critical design principle to not, like, coerce networking, which could lead to negative relationships, which can totally backfire, right? So I think that's a huge just baseline operating principle, Sheila, that I'm so glad you called out. Ami, can you bring us home? How does Braven, or how do you think about this?
I mean, in the world of Braven, it's been super interesting to watch over the last 7 years, starting with, like, year 2, when all of a sudden our college students were like, when can I be a leadership coach? I'm like, you're not in the professional network yet. You've got to get yourself there, and then you can come back in and be a leadership coach. And so I do think it's to what Sheila and Andrew and Chris, we've all said, like, it has to have real value for people to see why they should continue to be engaged. And I think now for us, it is wild now to see so many of our alums coming back to be coaches, to see how large the numbers are in certain of our employer partners, but also honestly to see just straight up, like, how they're doing long term in terms of their ability to be economically mobile. And thanks to a partnership that we have with LinkedIn, we are able to see how they're progressing in terms of whether or not they're getting promoted over time, et cetera. And so I always think about this as building a new network. Yes, there are lots of networks out there. I do not think they serve this group of students incredibly well over time unless we completely redo them and redesign them, really in service of this incredible group of young people who often gets overlooked when it comes to you know, the economy and them being full-fledged players in terms of being able to be economically mobile.
Awesome. Well, I want to just thank all four of you. Your wisdom on this topic, and I know because I've been studying it for the past 6 years, you guys are at the cutting edge and you're having to create things that have never existed before. And also, frankly, listen to the students and learners and workers you're serving in new ways as you build solutions that actually build networks that can create new opportunities in students' lives. So hopefully our audience enjoyed this session. We'll share contact information in the chat so you guys can hopefully get in touch. That's a good design principle around building networks. And thank you again to our amazing sponsors at ASA for making this session possible. Thanks all. Take care.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.